Our studio lot's 45 acres. It is, I believe, the only studio lot in the industry today that has a heritage going back to the founding fathers of the company. And it's the only studio lot that I know of that has had continuity in the ownership of the property all the way back to its beginnings.
I don't know what it's like now, but there was something quite incredible about going to work on Mickey Mouse Way and down Donald Duck Drive.
That was, hometown USA back there, and then a little street with a lot of houses, and doubled as a lot of villages through Disney Pictures. And most of them, if they weren't done in the back, they were done in the studio. That was the nice part about working for Disney. Didn't have to travel far.
The backlot was always filled, and there were different shows going on, different movies going on in different areas. It wasn't just one.
Walt Disney moved his studio from the old Hyperion Avenue lot in Hollywood over to Burbank in 1940. And at that time, they hadn't started doing any live-action filming. Audiences started asking him, how do you make your animated films? And can we see your movie studio? And of course, it was very difficult for him to have tours of the movie studio because it would interrupt all of his artists. And so he figured he would make a movie that would give a tour of the Disney studio. And that movie was The Reluctant Dragon, made in 1941. This was before there were any outdoor sets at the Disney studio, but it was the first outdoor filming around the Disney studio. The first time they actually used what they might call their back lot was in 1944 when they were filming The Three Caballeros. And they didn't actually build any sets back there, but they brought in some sand and it became a beach where the animated Donald Duck was interacting with some bathing beauties. It wasn't until the mid to late 1950s that Disney really felt, we need our own sets here because we're going to be doing more and more of these live-action films. At the same time, he was starting production on a half-hour television show called Zorro. He needed an early California set, which he couldn't even find at any of the other movie studios. So the Zorro set, built in 1957, was really the first real set at the Disney studio. There was a large fort, there was a number of smaller buildings, there was the house where Don Diego de la Vega lived. The Zorro series only lasted for 2 years, and so what we decided to do with that set was to turn it into a sort of a European town square. They put a huge tree in the middle of this town square for Monkeys Go Home in 1967. They could put French signs on all the buildings, and it was France. They could put Italian signs on all the buildings, and it was Italy. I remember when they did Bedknobs and Broomsticks, they had a sloping road going up to a large building with a large door, which was the museum. The fort and the surrounding buildings remained for a number of years on into the 1980s until they were finally torn down because we needed more parking. And we built a parking garage there. What do we call it? The Zorro parking garage.
I would say the whole lot is probably 3 or 4 city blocks square, something like that. And out of that, maybe the back lot would have been about a block, maybe. It was small, but it was laid out in a very ingenious manner. We had what we call berms.
Now, a berm, if you're not familiar, is an area where you have a mound of earth built up around this area so that you cannot see out of it. You're in your own little contained area.
So, for instance, you may have a horseshoe-shaped berm with tall trees, and in the middle of it, you may put a log cabin up where they did Johnny Tremaine or they did the Swamp Fox.
If you walk down the street to the east a little bit from the berm area, you would get into the business street. Now, the business street was originally built for Follow Me Boys back in the mid-1960s. Walt needed a place where he could film businesses, a shop, a store, whatever. And so this was done at that time. The biggest change came in 1981 when they actually tore down the whole business street and built a new one for Something Wicked This Way Comes. They had a town square. They built a very attractive bandstand that was sort of an icon for the business street from then on and was used a number of times. Attached to the business street was what we called our residential street. There were no straight streets. Everything curved, there were corners, there were angles, so that if you were shooting down the street, you wouldn't see the Western Street at the end of your residential street. It was around a corner. There were only 4 to start with. 2 on each side of the street were built for the absent-minded professor in 1961. Behind the house they used for Fred McMurray's house was the garage where he actually invented his flubber and stored his Model T Ford that he flew in. It's kind of interesting that what they did was take the same house that was Fred McMurray's house in The Absent-Minded Professor, but they used the side of the house as the front of the house for that darn cat. And for that film, they built another house next door where the nosy neighbor, Elsa Lanchester, lived. One of the big uses of this berm area just outside the residential area was Darby O'Gill and the Little People, because they actually built an Irish town there. The same area was used quite extensively for those Callaways, and they had a little lake built there.
It was big enough that the sequence in Apple Dumpling Gang, when Slim Pickens comes out of the water after the crash of the hook and ladder rig, that tail end of that sequence was shot on the back lot in that little pond.
They used it for Lieutenant Robin Crusoe with Dick Van Dyke, and it remained on into the 1980s also. There's now a gas station on its location. As we move out of the residential street, we find a large empty area, and then we get to the Western Street. Now, the Western Street was built originally for Texas John Slaughter and El Fuego Baca back around 1958. This was always the most fun place for me to go as a Disney employee as I was walking around the back lot, because you'd feel like you were in the Old West. Of course, a dirt street. There was a saloon, there was a bank, there was an opera house. The Apple Dumpling Gang was a film that really used the Western area quite extensively.
It seemed like, for me, it went on forever. That whole street that you see when you're going down when they have that wagon that's on fire, that was the whole street I remember.
The set was where they had set up everything, and everything else was pretty much just vacant, like a ghost town, and so you could just ride your bike and cruise around.
Almost all of the sets on the back lot were simply fronts. There was no interior to these sets. It wasn't always Westerns that were filmed on the Western Street. Sometimes it would just be an old-fashioned town, as in Toby Tyler. The circus parade went down the Western Street in Toby Tyler.
The Western Street at Disney had, although it's not a huge street, it had so many good angles and good places that you could still film and not see something that was either boring or not allowable because it wasn't in the right time area.
Just outside of the Western Street area was where Pete's Dragon was filmed. They actually built the town of Passamaquoddy there. The thing that impressed me so much is this huge lagoon that they built. That became part of the town of Passamaquoddy, which was a Maine seaport town. It was kind of amazing that we could do a Maine seaport in Burbank, California.
The last time I was there were a series of large office trailers where the backlot used to be. That Western Street was gone. It's entirely different. Every inch of real estate in the studio now has got some kind of building with some type of office in it.
As the years went by, there was more and more need for buildings on the Disney studio, and there was less and less need for backlot filming.
Studio lots are never a fixed environment. They ebb and flow, they change. And the Walt Disney Company, as most people know, in the 80s went through enormous growth.
In the late 80s, we finally tore down the Western Street and built in its location a large property warehouse where we store all of our props. The residential area was finally torn out in 1991 so that we could build 2 more sound stages in that area.
We didn't want to take away completely what was old and replace it with new, so we built a 1 city block long, generic exterior set. It's shops. There's a little restaurant or bar set on the corner.
Backlots were important in Hollywood from the early days of motion pictures on up until the 1980s primarily. The whole hustle and bustle of filmmaking at the Disney studio was exciting in those days, and It's just not the same anymore without the back lot. There's certainly going to be this legacy of people remembering the sets that were constructed at the Disney studio. It's always fun for film buffs to notice a particular building. Oh, that building I remember seeing in The Love Bug, or that building I remember seeing in The Apple Dumpling Gang. I think that memory is going to remain with people forever.